Well, now to Wall Street, where there's apparently a big comeback. As the economy struggles to rebound from the recession, 2012 turned out to be the second best year for bank profits. This chart you see here really puts it into perspective. You can see bank profits steadily increase until it hits a record high in 2008. And that's when it all literally goes downhill and the economy plummets into a recession. But you see in 2012, the banks are almost back to the record profits they hit before the recession, raking in $141 billion. Also at a record high, Wall Street bonuses. They're reportedly expected to rise 8% to $20 billion. Well, this is all wonderful for Wall Street, but what about the rest of the country? To discuss, I'm joined now by Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital. Hi, Peter. So it's the second, doing great, thanks, second best year for the big banks. Great for Wall Street, but is it a great sign for the economy as a whole?
Well, you know, it's good to be a banker, especially if you have Ben Bernanke at the Federal Reserve. The Fed's policy is to try to revive the economy by inflating the markets. That's great if you're a banker because you benefit on several fronts. The markets are more vibrant, so you can make more money speculating, but also it's cheaper to borrow, and that's a lot of the source of the speculation. So the banks are doing really well under this environment. But the U.S. economy is not doing well at all. In fact, people think that there's a recovery going on. It's not. The economy is actually getting sicker as a result of the current Fed policy.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem to add up. The financial industry takes home a third of all corporate profits. What does this mean for the average citizen, and how dangerous is it for the economy to be in the hands of the banks, essentially?
Well, it's very dangerous that the government, through monetary and fiscal policy, is funneling such a large percentage of our resources into the financial sector. And it's not just a financial sector. Look at government. You know, it pays to be in government. Look at the salaries of the bureaucrats and the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So the bankers and the bureaucrats are thriving under this phony economy. But average Americans working on Main Street or not working because they can't get jobs because the resources necessary to employ them are in Washington, D.C. or in New York City, it's not doing well. And eventually, of course, this whole phony economy that the Fed has created is going to come collapsing down. And in the long run, the bankers are going to lose money. Hopefully, we don't have another round of bailouts. But in the meantime, they're getting rich as the economy suffers.
Yeah, getting rich. By that, we mean Wall Street bonuses rise to $20 billion most recently at a time that the economy is shrinking. Peter, how does that add up?
Well, it doesn't add up. And I think Wall Street's gain is Main Street's pain. And people think the economy is expanding. Look at we just got the GDP numbers, the revised fourth quarter, and it showed a slight expansion, 0.1%. But that's only because the government assumes that there's no inflation. They want us to believe that inflation is at about 1.5%. Inflation, in my opinion, is at least 5%, if not quite a bit more. But even if inflation is only 3%, that means the U.S. economy is contracting, and which makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, the reason that it doesn't feel like a recovery for most people is because it's not. It's still a recession. But it's certainly, you know, good times in the banks or good times in Washington, D.C., because that's where all our money is going. If you're wondering why it's so hard to make ends meet on Main Street, it's because some bureaucrat is eating your lunch.
Speaking of Main Street and Washington, D.C., we reported yesterday how Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, she was drilling Ben Bernanke over too big to fail, pointing out that the big banks get $83 billion a year in taxpayer subsidies. So could the big banks even survive without the taxpayers propping them up?
Well, many of them would have already failed, so the answer is no. But, you know, Ben Bernanke wasn't even being honest with Senator Warren. Of course, he's not honest with anybody. But on that particular issue, he was disingenuous at best, because when she is talking about that subsidy, and it's hard to quantify exactly what it is, but Ben Bernanke acted as if the subsidy was there for the stockholders of the banks. It's not. The subsidy makes it easier for the banks to borrow money. It makes it easier for the banks to attract depositors who want to put their money in an institution that's too big to fail. I mean, if you've got more money than the FDIC maximums, you want to make sure you're in a bank that's going to get bailed out. You don't want to take your chances on a smaller bank. And so that does give the big banks an unfair advantage to attract customers and to borrow money. And even if the banks fail, the depositors are still going to get bailed out. The secured creditors are still going to get bailed out. And Ben Bernanke, was oblivious to that. He focused on the stockholders, but that's not where the subsidy is most important. It's with attracting capital through lenders and through depositors, and it is an unfair advantage. Personally, I keep a lot of my money in Bank of America, even though I believe that they're insolvent. And if it wasn't for this too big to fail, I wouldn't have a dime of my money there. But now the problem is a much sounder, smaller institution doesn't get my business. And now when Bank of America potentially fails, the taxpayers are going to have to bail me out. Whereas if the government didn't have that guarantee, I never would have put my money in harm's way in the first place.
Certainly didn't get any clear answers from Mr. Bernanke yesterday, or convincing answers. But, the argument that you do here is that shutting down these big banks would be disastrous to the economy, and that these guys that had these banks are the only ones with the special knowledge to run them, and that's why their bonuses are justified. Is that all a fair argument?
Yeah. Well, spoken like a banker. Of course, it's going to be bad for the people involved. And yeah, I mean, in the short run, we're going to have to swallow our medicine. We're going to have to admit to a lot of serious problems that right now we're papering over. But, it's not like, what's good for the Wall Street banks is good for America. That's not the case. Actually, what's good for those banks in the short run is actually quite bad for America, because we're diverting resources that are badly needed in other parts of the economy, and we're sending them to Wall Street. What we need is more factories in this country, not more banks. We need to produce more. We need to export more. We need to save more.
Right.
And
that
unfortunately,
is the
none of
about
this is
the
taking
banks.
place.
People are asking, I'm sorry to interrupt you. They're asking, what are they even producing? They're getting a third of the profits, but what are they actually producing? What are they contributing to society? Want to ask you, though, is there any incentive to change the situation? I mean, people look back since the recession and are wondering, too big to fail seems still to be a phrase that's going to stick around. Is there any incentive for this to change, especially when we're talking about lobbying and all of that? Exactly.
Yeah, the people in power, the people who benefit from the status quo, they have no incentive to change it. And of course, politicians don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to do anything that might, bring about any kind of short-term pain, even if it produces long-term gain. They're not in it for the country. They're in it to line their own pockets. They want to make as much money for themselves. They want to get reelected. And if that means they have to sacrifice the country in the process, well, that's a sacrifice they're willing to make. So I think the only thing that's going to change this is a crash, a crisis, which is going to come in the U.S. currency and in the U.S. bond market. We're only going to change when we have no alternative, when the circumstances force us to change. Unfortunately, by then, the problems would have gotten so much bigger, and the pain associated with correcting them is going to be so much greater.
Yeah, hopefully that's not what it takes, Peter, but great to have you on the show. That was Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital.